Welcome back to the Health Physics Society's video series pursuing the truth and promoting transparency regarding the historical foundations of the current radiation protection philosophy based on a linear no-threshold theory for cancer risk assessment. I'm Dr. John Cardarelli, President of the Health Physics Society. In the 10th episode, we learned that above-ground nuclear tests and the associated fallout spawned the birth of the LNT activism. Geneticists confronted the Atomic Energy Commission, and President Eisenhower authorized the National Academy of Science to study the biological effects of radiation, which was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. In this episode, we describe how the National Academy of Science organized this study effort and the role of the Rockefeller Foundation. Was there any potential bias involved in selecting members to serve on the Genetics Committee? How important was it for the committee to study radiation effects on humans? And what species did they ultimately base their conclusions on? Let's watch.
The big thing that happened was in a political sense, in a scientific sense, and that is the Rockefeller Foundation. They wrote to President Eisenhower, and they suggested to Eisenhower that the U.S. government create a study of all the implications of radioactivity within the environment, very broad, and that it should be undertaken by the National Academy of Sciences, and they should look at I'm going to say genetic effects and medical effects and agricultural effects and disposal effects, lots of different things. They came up with six different areas, and as it turns out, Eisenhower endorsed that. And Eisenhower was an advocate of, atoms for peace, and that was one of his big, statements and so forth. But he also wanted to, I think, with this push from the Rockefeller Foundation, to have this all guided by the best and the brightest in this country, and this was a time to do it. And it was, heightened concern, and so let's try to do this. And they, in the letter that they wrote to Eisenhower, they specifically brought up their concerns with genetic damage. They specifically brought that up. And so they kind of like more or less, tried to make him aware that there was a public health concern here and that he had to be aware of that concern. And so Eisenhower gave the authority to move forward on this and to have the National Academy do this. Well, but something weird happens here. I mean, I've been on a number of National Academy committees from probably the early 80s on, that sort of thing. And how it works in this country, I mean, at least my understanding is that, yes, the NAS is there to advise the country on problems that are important. And usually what happens is that a federal agency, like the FAA or the EPA or some other group, they think there's a problem, they come up with some money, and they negotiate with the National Academy, and they create an advisory committee that will pay for the travel, the staff, and whatever is necessary to make this into a report, and however that report's going to do. In this case, it was different. In this case, the group that funded it was not the AEC or some other, health, education, and welfare at the time, or some other group. The Rockefeller Foundation, which is a private group, they gave the money to the National Academy of Sciences to conduct this work. And that to me was, in retrospect, a very unusual circumstance. I don't know whether that's ever been done in any other circumstance before, but that was done in this particular case. And there was also another unusual situation that was here, and the president of the National Academy of Sciences was Detlev Bronk at that time. He was also the president of the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research at the same time. That's going to become Rockefeller University, and they'll just change the name. And so he was also on the board of directors of the Rockefeller Foundation. And so there was a high degree of inbreeding that was going on, that the Rockefeller Foundation was going to be funding work that one of their own people was going to be in charge of, and that somehow the U.S. Congress or whatever governmental entities oversees the actions of the NAS, they allowed him to be the president of a Rockefeller-funded university. And so this was a very unusual circumstance, and one could look into the history of the Rockefellers and their industry and their foundation, and take a look at perhaps what their interests were, what would serve their interests. And so this becomes a very intriguing historical, political, economic, framework.
Perception of a conflict, if not indeed a real conflict.
That's
that
right.
Existed in that.
And so what happens next is very significant, because these committees were created in 1955. And what becomes very significant is that the genetics committee had never been, there really hadn't been in this country a genetics committee. The geneticists were always involved with evaluation, but they were always part of a medical committee. And the medical committees, it depended on the committee. It might have been 10 or 12 or 14 people on a committee. And the geneticists would usually be about 1 or 2, at the most 3, but never a dominant force on a committee. There were other types of medicine that were around the table, and geneticists had their say. But when they had their say about the nature of the dose response in the low dose zone, they always lost. They recommended, because of Muller and the camaraderie of how they thought about dose response and their views, they supported in general a linear dose response relationship without question. The other branches of medicine did not. They supported a threshold. And there was always a conflict between them, and it was a conflict that was pretty harsh if you read the literature. That it's always like being on the losing team of a baseball game, and you pick up sides and things of that nature. Or however it is politically in this country, if you live in a state that's always one party or the other, and you think the opposite way, they never represent you like you would want to be represented, you might think. And so in this case, the LNT always lost. The geneticists always lost. So, but what Detlev Bronk did was very significant. What he did changed everything. He decided to give the geneticists their own voice. And so, yes, there would be a medical committee, but guess what? It wouldn't be part of medicine. Medicine would have their own. The geneticists would have their own standalone, equal to the others committee. That had never been done before in this country. Now, what happens is that for all the other 5 committees, they chose what I'm going to say, very technical people to chair those committees, and they got technical people to serve on those committees. However, National Academy committees are selected. In the case of the genetics committee, it was handled differently. And this is interesting. They didn't choose a geneticist to chair the committee. And there were some very significant geneticists in this country. You could even start with Muller. He was a Nobel Prize winner. But there were a goodly number of high-level, very experienced, socially adept people that you want to have in charge of these sorts of major committees. They didn't do that. So what they did do is that they chose the director of research for the Rockefeller Foundation, Warren Weaver, to be the chair of the genetics committee.
That seems like another conflict.
And so now the other thing, back in the day, this is not today's world where most of our money comes from the federal government, if you're an academic researcher. Back in those days, the biggest funder for academic research was the Rockefeller Foundation. The Carnegie Foundation funded some, but the Rockefeller Foundation was the biggest one. And Warren Weaver, who was the director of the research for the Rockefeller Foundation, had been the director of the research there since about 1933. He'd been there for 23 or 4 or 5 years, at that time. Long time. And he knew all the players. He was funding everyone. He was responsible for paying Muller's salary when he was in Edinburgh. He was responsible for giving Muller his money when he went over, ultimately left Amherst College, right? He was responsible for funding the entire research operation for geneticists at Indiana University. He was responsible for funding Sturtevant and these other people who wrote at Caltech. Now, he funded the whole cadre of academic geneticist researchers. He knew them all, knew how they thought on many different matters. And there was a certain loyalty. I'm not sure if from my point of view and from an academic, is that if you're asked by your funder to serve in a committee, you serve on the committee, and you kind of read the tea leaves and the vibes of what your manager, your grant funder is saying.
Oh, I think I wouldn't go so far as to say that with any certainty there would be bias, but there is a huge potential for bias in that situation. And even if it's only the perception by the public that there could be a bias there, I think that's problematic for an institution that should be neutral. And so even without an established conflict or bias, I think that it is a mistake to have that kind of intertwined relationships between the committee and the chair and the funding center, and it does not look good.
Well, let's take this one step further. It gets even more interesting. I would say that just about everybody who was on that committee as a geneticist had a public record in the literature of supporting LNT. So you knew where they stood, even on the basis of what their public written in the journals record was. So, and there were geneticists out there that were not part of the team that actually supported a threshold model, and there were a number of them, but none of them were selected. Actually, the ones that were selected all had strong allegiance to an LNT model. That becomes very significant here, because the prevailing model in society, in regulatory society in this country and elsewhere at that time, was the threshold model. And so when I got really interested in this, I knew what the answer was. I knew this committee was going to go LNT, and I knew they had gone LNT. And so, but I wanted to understand what the debate was. How did they debate it? And they're all smart people, all very experienced people. How did they shoot it down? Who was the leader? What was the debate all about? And I said that would just give me so much, intellectual fun to see how these smart people decided all this thing. So, and I can tell you that one of my great disappointments in all this work here is that when I got all the what do you call it, the tape recordings of all their meetings. And so I wanted to see what did Muller say? What did this one say? What did that one say? And when I went through it, I found they had no debate at all. None.
That's astounding.
No debate. What they did, then very early into it, Muller's colleague at the University of Indiana, Tracy Sonneborn, he got up and he read the equivalent of the Apostles' Creed. He read what radiation geneticists believe. And this is their belief. And it was that all damage is cumulative, it's not repairable, it's not reversible, and the dose response is linear down to a single ionization. And he read that right into the record. And there was no challenging and no debate. Right from the beginning. And so I looked at that and I said, God, I said, this was decided like with a TKO in the first round. It was over. And I was looking for, somebody to stand up and say, well, I believe in a threshold. Let me tell you why I believe. None of that. None of them believed in a threshold. So there was no airing of any opposition. It was a stacked deck. It was as if you wanted a jury to decide something and you handpicked the jury. And that's really how this played out. Now, the interesting thing here was that this is how the committee started in the first opening rounds of the committee. And so you might say, well, it's all decided now. I mean, maybe we can go home and not meet. But the problem and they should have actually, but what happened was that they had money in the budget to meet like 7 or 8 times. So they had to be given, like a teacher at school, they gave make work to the students to keep them busy, to keep them out of trouble. And so the worst thing you can do to smart people is to give them make work and to keep them out of trouble, because the only thing that's going to happen to them is, like kids in school, is they're going to get into trouble. And so I'll kind of get into that. But before they gave them this make work sort of thing, and actually even before, Tracy Sonneborn stood up and read the geneticist version of the Apostles' Creed into the public record, this right here is like a seminal thing. And that is that on the committee was this guy by the name of James V. Neal. He's a professor of genetics at the University of Michigan in the medical school. He got his PhD from Kurt Stern, believe it or not, at Rochester, and then he decided to go to Dartmouth and get a medical degree. So he's a unique sort of a medical geneticist in his own right. And so because of all that, and because he was getting it towards the end of the war, he was drafted into the war, and with the dropping of the bomb, he was, you might say, ordered or sent or identified as a unique talent. I mean, he's a uniquely educated person in genetics and in medicine, even though he hadn't done any radiation work. And they sent him over to Japan in the aftermath of the dropping of the bomb. And picture this relatively young guy. He's got a PhD and an MD, but he's still a young guy. He's probably, about 30 years old and around that age. And he goes over to Japan, and he gets tapped to be one of the big leaders in the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, the big study of all the effects that happen over in Japan as a result of the dropping of the two bombs. And so since he's a geneticist, he gets focused on a study that you alluded to earlier, and that is the effects of the atomic bomb on the offspring of the people who were survivors. And did they develop adverse genetic effects, mutations, and so forth as a result of their parents having been exposed to the bomb? And for most people, and I know you gave the conclusion and brought it to the recent times, but me thinking of me not being a professor of toxicology and aware of the knowledge that goes into these studies, I would have thought that, well, it wouldn't be that unlikely that people could have been born with maybe all kinds of genetic effects, right? I mean, visual things that could look really weird, and other kinds of 7 fingers, or however things go, that once you start blasting them with all kinds of radiation, anything could happen. I mean, I've seen so many scary movies on television as a kid growing up. Anything could happen. And so Jim Neal and colleagues, and there were a lot of colleagues from Japan and the United States that made up this, and they tried to do a study as best they could possibly do. They had a lot of resources between in doing this as well. And so as it turns out, fast forward to this committee from 1945 until now it's 1955, and the committee finally meets. Well, Neal and his colleagues have just finished the 10th year anniversary big report on what they learned about all the effects of the atomic bomb on birth defects and other genetic effects in this population of Japanese. And there were about 75,000 people that they were following, a lot of people. And so, as it turns out, as you indicate, to my total amazement and wonder, they didn't find any significant treatment effects. Just hard for me to even understand and believe that, since I'm not a geneticist and I was, as I said, overly influenced by watching too much television as a child, and being afraid of it all, right? But the reality, when it was studied, according to Neal and all the people who worked with him, is that they did not see a significant increase over this 10-year period. So that's a big deal finding, okay? Now, they put it into about a 300-page report. Neal, on the first meeting, he actually sent a copy earlier than that to Muller, but in the first meeting, he gives this to the committee, and it's shared, and he wants this is what needs to be part of what we're going to be looking at, right? So what actually happens in this is that two members go up and say the most important thing we can study are humans, the study of of mankind deserves the study of, of humans. This is critical. And then two of them got up and stated this, but the real leader of the group then stood up, and that was Muller. And Muller indicated that study, that 10-year study of 75,000 people, should have no standing, and it should not be studied.
Did he have any reasons for that?
He had only a couple of attitudinally negative responses, but nothing major. It was like a powerful, the king got up and spoke. And you would have thought that, well, Jim Neal, this is 10 years of his life. He's now 40 years old. He should be able to handle himself, Nobel Prize winner or not. And he said nothing. He just stood up and said, I think that the study of man should really focus on man. But he didn't challenge Muller, so he became a third person to say it, and they never, ever took that study up. After the fact, he then sent the study separately on his own dime, you might say, to all the other members of the committee so they could see the most critical chapter in this 300-page thing. But it was never, ever discussed again in any of the meetings, the most critical thing. Now, to understand what he did was, just picture this yourself, right? You've been at something for 10 years. It's your life. It's studying the effects of the atomic bomb. This is big, right? And this committee that you're on, the National Academy of Sciences Committee to study the effects of radiation on human populations, refuses to look at this study, and you're a member of that committee. And that project that you're leading is actually also funded by who? The National Academy of Sciences. And your guy, your leader, Muller, says it's not going to have scientific standing. And it doesn't. It is not reviewed. So what does Neal do in his conniving, boyish sort of a way? He sneaks the study over to the British, because they have their own version of this going on. And they also created a genetics committee. And so I got all the letters between the genetics committee and Neal. And Neal never informed his own group this is what happened. It was quiet between him and them. I mean, talk about loyalties, disloyalties, honesties, lack of honesties. And they go back and forth, and they like his study. They have criticisms and they raise questions. He answers like you would do if you did any report. And in the end, when they came out of their report, which was published on the same day that the U.S. was on, I think it was June 12, 1956, they came out with high praise for Neal and his study, and it had a profound influence on how they evaluated risk. In this country, well, what happened is we gave no standing to this major study, and so we reverted back to what? The Delta-Uphoff study that we don't know how to interpret.
Of flies,
and the Spencer study. And so human risk assessment that came forth from this National Academy of Sciences committee was based on those two flawed reports. Ignored the other. Now I have to say I've been following this dose response thing and Muller and LNT thing for a long time. And I don't know how I missed it, but maybe this is how everybody else missed it. I only learned about this ignoring of the study about 18 months ago. I mean, you would think that if I was doing my homework, I read everything, I try to do this, I talk to lots of people. Nobody seemed to know this. It was hidden. And one of the things, the way it gets hidden, is that somebody like Jim Neal, in 1994 or so, he writes an autobiography. It's called Physician to the Gene. Beautiful book, nice book, big publisher. I read the whole thing. I have to tell you, he doesn't mention this once in his book. You would think that if you were treated so shabbily, not just by Muller, but all your peers, that you would have had, I mean, for me, I'm not sure you, but for me, if I came in with a 10-year study and I really believed in that study and it had significance, I would have banged my fist on the table. I'd have yelled and screamed. I'd have written to Detlev Bronk. I would have written to Eisenhower, probably, for that matter. But he didn't do anything.
Well, especially he wrote his autobiography in 1994.
Right.
By then, his study results had been confirmed over additional years of study. To this day, we don't see a signal of genetic damage. So he not only was his study, I haven't read it, so I don't know, but it sounds like it was a sound study, but it has withstood the test of time for 70 years now.
Well, it's even sustained it even after he died. He died of prostate cancer in 2000, and the last report on it, I believe, was 2015, and they basically verify whatever came before. And I'd have to say, too, that, in 1946, when they started, the knowledge of genetics and endpoints that they measured were good for the time, and they did the best that they could. But over time, genetics has had all kinds of revolutions in terms of what they could measure, how they measured it. And the study over in Japan incorporated these measures, advanced measures for much more subtle endpoints, and even looking at all the new wave of subtle endpoints, because they couldn't turn their back on new science, right? You're looking to find a problem, right? And you've got a better mousetrap to find that problem. You look, and they added those, and they still could not find this. And so this was a very, very big issue. Now I'm gonna say one thing for Neil. You would think that Neil was timid and he was beaten and he just took it. But I'm going to tell you that Neil exploded at some point, and that becomes part of our story. But there's one thing that because he explodes after the end of this committee's work, that comes back to bite everybody, actually. But this committee, you would think that the worst thing that they possibly could have done was to give no scientific standing to the most relevant study possible, right? But it wasn't the worst thing. At least for that one, they didn't lie. They didn't commit scientific misconduct. They may have been terribly biased. They may have just been intimidated by Mueller. Whatever this committee, however they made that poorly informed decision, at least it wasn't dishonest. It might have been hidden. Everything else you can say about it, but it wasn't falsification of the research record. It wasn't fabrication of it. They were just absolutely biased and intimidated, I think, to take on their leader.
Well, I do look forward to what happens next.
Thank you for watching the 11th episode on the historical foundations of the linear no-threshold theory, where we learned that Detlev Bronk was the president of the National Academy of Science, president of Rockefeller University, and a member of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. He created 6 committees to look at a variety of radiation effects on humans and the environment. And most importantly, he created a committee specifically for geneticists, which was emphasized in the Rockefeller letter to President Eisenhower. Detlev Bronk appointed Warren Weaver, the director of research for the Rockefeller Foundation and a non-geneticist, to lead the genetics committee. During their second meeting, Tracy Sonneborn read a charge to the committee stating what the minimum the committee could agree on without dispute. Key points included the understanding of effects on humans was a primary concern and that gene mutations were linear with total dose. James Neal shares the results of a 10-year study on the atomic bomb survivors, which did not support the LNT model. But the committee, under the influence of Mueller, chose not to include in their deliberations, despite their earlier agreement that effects on humans was a primary concern. Instead, they relied completely on previous fruit fly research that had numerous scientific flaws pointed out by Dr. Calabrese. The British obtained a copy of Neal's study, communicated with him extensively on the findings during their own deliberations, and acknowledged the value of his work in their publication. In the next episode, we will learn how the Genetics Committee estimated the number of birth defects from a 10 rad or 0.1 gray dose. If you haven't been surprised yet, you might be in the next episode. The HPS is a trusted source of radiation information. We're a scientific organization, and as is offered with the scientific peer review process, Viewers are encouraged to send comments or suggested corrections to factcheck@hps.org, and be sure to include your sources so that we may correct the record if necessary. If any changes are made, they will appear at the end of this episode. Please visit our Ask the Experts website to ask questions or seek answers to common radiation-related questions, and view our fact sheets. We also have official position statements that can be found at hps.org. Finally, if you wish to join the Home for Radiation Protection Professionals, please visit the link below. We welcome you.